The flight was just about to take off, the engines roaring as the passengers settled into their seats, and the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was one of luxury and calm. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. A black man, dressed simply in a dark hoodie and jeans, walked down the aisle, carrying only his carry-on bag. He seemed unremarkable at first, blending in with the wealthy passengers around him. But when he reached his seat in the first-class section, a flight attendant's harsh voice sliced through the air. "You don't belong here," she snapped, glaring at him as she pointed toward the back of the plane. Confusion rippled through the cabin. Was this some mistake? What happened next would make everyone on board rethink their assumptions, and no one could have predicted the shocking twist that would unfold. What happens next might make you rethink everything you know about power, identity, and what happens when you challenge an unjust system. Stay with us as this story unravels. Moments after the flight attendant's cutting words, the man did something unexpected. Calm and composed, he simply smiled. The flight attendant, Linda, didn't seem to notice at first, but she began to get agitated as he continued to sit there, unmoving. Her eyes scanned the room, her mind racing through the options she had, but something inside her told her this wasn't going to go the way she expected. Her voice grew louder, her confidence growing as she approached him again. "I told you, you're in the wrong place. You need to move to the back." But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a single call. "I need Protocol 6 activated," he said calmly into the receiver. This wasn't just any random passenger. The whole system was about to come crashing down. Meanwhile, Linda was oblivious to the true identity of the man she was so willing to humiliate. "This is my plane," he said, now looking her directly in the eye. The tension in the cabin heightened as the other passengers turned their heads, whispers filling the air. Linda hesitated, confused, and slightly embarrassed. But the man wasn't done. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice. He simply let the situation unfold, knowing what was coming next. Within minutes, the flight attendant's authority crumbled. "You called me a fraud in the company I own," he said, his voice low but sharp. The entire cabin fell silent, eyes widening as the realization hit. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate, a prejudiced assumption that had spiraled out of control. The flight attendant's face drained of color, her confidence now shattered. The man, who had remained so composed, stood up. His stature seemed to grow before everyone's eyes. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the systems that controlled everything: the flight, the passengers, the crew. "I'm the CEO of this airline. You don't tell people like me where to sit," he said, as his words echoed throughout the cabin. Linda was speechless, her mouth open but no words coming out. The man stood tall, his power evident as he looked down at the stunned flight attendant. His calm demeanor sent shockwaves through the room as he slowly pulled out his corporate ID and showed it to her. The realization dawned on Linda, and the silence was deafening. The moment Linda realized her mistake, the tension in the cabin was almost palpable. What had started as a routine flight had turned into an explosive display of power and retribution. Passengers, once quietly observing, now shifted in their seats, whispers rippling through the first-class cabin. Some pulled out their phones, recording every second, while others just sat back, watching the inevitable collapse of the system unfold. It was clear now, this wasn't about a simple seating issue. This was about something much bigger: systemic racism, assumptions made based on appearance, and the consequences of those assumptions. As Linda stumbled to explain herself, the man raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. "No more words," he said. "Actions have consequences." With a flick of his fingers, the entire cabin was put on alert. The man had not only revealed his true identity, but also activated a protocol that would change everything for the airline and its staff. As the man spoke to the flight attendants, the air in the cabin shifted from disbelief to a strange mix of awe and discomfort. Passengers now saw not just a man, but the weight of an institution, the weight of power and the burden of an unspoken history. The man turned to Linda and her colleagues, his voice calm but cutting. "You are all dismissed," he said. The entire crew, once confident in their authority, now stood frozen, realizing they had just lost their jobs in a single moment. The flight attendant's face went pale, and her colleagues stood motionless, unable to comprehend the sudden downfall. The man's words were final, and the realization hit hard. In a matter of minutes, the entire flight crew had been stripped of their power, their positions, and their dignity. The passengers were stunned, some in disbelief, others in quiet satisfaction. But the twist didn't end there. The man turned to the other passengers, addressing them directly. This is what happens when you assume you can judge someone based on their appearance. But more importantly, this is what happens when those assumptions are allowed to go unchecked. He spoke not with anger, but with a calm authority that demanded respect. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the standard, he said. Today, I am reminding everyone here. No one should ever be treated less than because of the color of their skin or the way they are dressed. The cabin was filled with a quiet, reverent silence. The passengers, now realizing the depth of the situation, gave a quiet round of applause, not for the drama they had just witnessed, but for the undeniable truth that had just been laid bare. The man had not just reclaimed his dignity, he had dismantled the prejudices that stood in his way. As the flight continued, the passengers couldn't stop talking about what had happened. What had started as a simple flight had turned into a powerful lesson on race, power, and respect. The CEO's actions had shaken them to their core, reminding them all of the hidden biases that lurked beneath the surface. And as they disembarked, they walked away with a new understanding of what true power looked like. Not the power to humiliate or belittle others, but the power to stand tall, unshaken, and to speak truth to injustice. Stay tuned for more stories of justice, revenge, and real power. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more. The flight was just about to take off, the engines roaring as passengers settled into their first-class seats. The atmosphere was calm, filled with luxury and quiet chatter. But then, everything changed. A black man, dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans, walked down the aisle, blending in with the other passengers. He reached his seat in the first-class section and took a seat. But when the flight attendant, Linda, noticed him, she froze. Her eyes narrowed as she approached, her voice sharp and condescending. "You don't belong here," she snapped, pointing toward the back of the plane. The cabin fell silent. The man didn't react immediately. Instead, he simply raised an eyebrow, his demeanor calm, but there was something about him that didn't fit the story she thought she knew. As Linda stared down at him, her assumption seemed to grow bolder. "Move to the back," she ordered, now louder, expecting compliance. But the man didn't budge. Moments passed in tense silence before the man pulled out his phone and made a single call. "Activate Protocol 6, he said, his voice steady and calm. There was no panic in his tone, only certainty. Linda looked at him, confused, but before she could ask any questions, he looked back up at her, his eyes hard with a quiet intensity. "I own this plane," he said. The words hit like a shockwave, spreading through the cabin in an instant. Linda's face drained of color as realization hit her like a punch. This wasn't just any passenger, it was the CEO of the airline. The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point as passengers whispered among themselves, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Linda stood frozen, her mind racing. "You're not just anyone," she stammered, trying to regain control. But the man, still seated, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her, unblinking, as though challenging her assumptions. His next words shattered any remaining illusion of power she had. "You called me a fraud in the company I own. Now, I'm calling for your termination." The words fell like a guillotine. The air grew thick with disbelief as the rest of the crew began to realize what was happening. It was no longer just about the seating arrangement. It was about something much deeper, a lesson in the consequences of discrimination. As Linda tried to stammer an apology, the man didn't react with anger, but with a quiet authority. "I'm not interested in your apologies," he said, his voice calm but full of power. "What I'm interested in is accountability." With a wave of his hand, a signal was sent out to the rest of the staff. Within moments, the airline's systems were activated, blocking access for the entire crew involved in the incident. Linda's access to the flight's operations was locked out immediately. She couldn't access her station or even communicate with her team. The power had shifted in an instant. Her face turned pale as she stood there, paralyzed by the realization of her mistake. The passengers in the cabin were now fully aware of the situation. Some were recording on their phones, while others watched in stunned silence. The man stood up, towering over the now silent flight attendant. "This is not just about this moment," he said, addressing the entire cabin. This is about how we treat people based on their appearance. How assumptions and prejudices are still allowed to dictate our behavior. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the standard, he added. The quiet reverence in the room was palpable. Some passengers began to applaud, not because of the drama, but because of the courage it took to stand up in such a moment. Linda, her face a mix of humiliation and fear, stumbled back to the galley, followed by her fellow crew members, who stood in stunned silence. The CEO turned toward the remaining staff and spoke directly to them. I don't need to explain myself to any of you, but I will tell you this. If any of you ever make this mistake again, you'll find yourselves answering to far more than just me. His voice carried an undeniable weight. You are all dismissed for today. The crew was frozen in place, their positions shattered. There was no yelling, no shouting, just the quiet finality of the moment. As the CEO sat back down in his seat, he addressed the passengers once more. Let this be a reminder, he said, his voice steady, that we all have a role to play in changing the way this world operates. We must be better than the assumptions that have been built into our systems. He sat back, his calm authority making him the undeniable force in the room. The rest of the flight passed in a quiet atmosphere, the once oppressive tension now replaced by a quiet understanding among the passengers. No one dared challenge what had just happened. Everyone had witnessed a change in power, a dismantling of the old system, and an undeniable message that no one was exempt from the consequences of their actions. Stay tuned for more stories of justice, revenge, and real power. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more. The flight continued on its steady path toward Los Angeles, but the mood in the first-class cabin had completely shifted. The passengers who had witnessed the exchange were no longer casually relaxing. They were alert, uncertain, and in some cases, downright uncomfortable. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. The CEO, still seated in his original spot, remained calm, seemingly unaffected by the chaos he had caused. Linda, the flight attendant who had once been so confident in her authority, was now hiding in the back galley, unable to face the passengers she had tried to control so forcefully. The other crew members stood around her, nervously glancing at each other, unsure of what to do next. They had all just learned a hard lesson about the weight of their assumptions and the power of a single moment. A moment that had turned their entire reality upside down. In the front of the plane, the CEO's assistant had already activated the internal corporate system, pulling up records and sending immediate instructions to the airline's management. Within minutes, Linda's access to the flight's operations was officially locked. Her uniform no longer represented authority. It had become a symbol of shame. The CEO's action was swift and precise, the kind of leadership that commanded respect not by force, but by the power of truth. He was no longer just a man on a plane. He was a man on a mission, and no one in that cabin could deny it. The remaining flight attendants, still reeling from the shock, began whispering among themselves. They were unsure whether to apologize to the CEO, to remain silent, or to justify their actions. But deep down, they knew this wasn't about just one mistake. It was about a culture of bias that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. They had treated the man like an outsider because of the way he looked, and now they were paying the price. The passengers, who had quietly watched the drama unfold, began to shift their focus. Some recorded the scene on their phones. Others simply sat back, processing the turn of events. It was clear now that they had witnessed something far beyond a simple seating mistake. They had witnessed a systemic failure in real time. As the flight continued, the CEO remained unbothered by the whispers around him. He knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. He had seen this kind of prejudice before in the corporate world, in the air, and in the everyday lives of people who looked like him. He had built his company from the ground up, overcoming obstacles that few could imagine, and yet the world still saw him as a threat, as someone who didn't belong. Today, he was going to make sure that the message was loud and clear. No one was going to get away with treating him, or anyone else, this way again. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by as the plane climbed higher. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was on the future he was about to reshape. Meanwhile, Linda, still hiding in the galley, was on the phone with her supervisor. Her hands trembled as she explained what had happened, her voice shaking with disbelief. Her supervisor, who had been briefed by the CEO's team, responded with a simple, cold instruction: stay put. We're handling it. Linda could feel her career slipping through her fingers, knowing that she had just made the biggest mistake of her professional life. But there was no turning back now. She had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, and now she was going to have to face the consequences. Back in the cabin, a low murmur of conversation spread as the CEO's words continued to echo in the minds of the passengers. One by one, they began to realize what had truly happened. They had been complicit in a system that allowed discrimination to run unchecked. They had witnessed a moment of blatant bias, and now they were being forced to reckon with it. The man in the hoodie wasn't just some random passenger. He was someone who had earned his place at the top, someone who had built this airline from the ground up. And he had just shown them all the power of standing up to prejudice, of refusing to be treated as anything less than what he was, a force to be reckoned with. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the CEO stood up, making his way toward the cockpit. He didn't need to say anything more. The actions he had taken spoke louder than words ever could. As he passed by the crew, Linda couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. She knew her job was done. The other flight attendants, too, avoided his gaze, knowing they had failed him. It wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about a culture that had been allowed to thrive unchecked, and the CEO had just torn it down. The plane touched down in Los Angeles, the passengers slowly gathering their things as the tension in the cabin lingered. The CEO walked off the plane with his head held high, knowing that this moment had changed everything. He had made a statement, and the world was about to hear it. He had turned a simple act of discrimination into a powerful lesson on leadership, on accountability, and on the true meaning of respect. As the crew disembarked, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. The CEO's actions didn't just impact the people on that flight. They would ripple through the company, through the industry, and beyond. Linda and the other crew members would soon face the consequences of their actions. The CEO had sent a clear message. There was no room for discrimination in his company, and no one, no matter their position, would ever be allowed to get away with it again. The world would watch, and they would learn that standing up to prejudice wasn't just a choice. It was a responsibility. The passengers, as they left the plane, were left to reflect on what they had witnessed. Some were inspired, others uncomfortable, but all of them knew that something had shifted that day. In that small, enclosed space at 30,000 feet, the battle against bias had been won. Not with violence, not with anger, but with the quiet power of one person refusing to be treated as less than what they were. The flight attendant had learned the hard way that assumptions could cost you everything, and in the end, the CEO had shown them all what true leadership looked like. Yindi, as the CEO stepped off the plane in Los Angeles, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The passengers who had been a part of the drama, still processing the events, slowly began to file out behind him. It was as if the energy had shifted within the cabin, leaving behind a heavy sense of accountability. Linda, the flight attendant who had started the whole incident, stood frozen, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The realization of what had just transpired was starting to sink in. Her actions had not only humiliated the CEO, but they had exposed something much deeper, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface of the airline industry for far too long. Meanwhile, the other crew members followed closely behind, their heads low, too embarrassed to make eye contact with anyone, especially the passengers who had witnessed their failure. Back in the terminal, as the CEO made his way toward the gate, he was met by a team of executives who had been waiting for him. They had been watching the situation unfold in real time, thanks to the internal system he had triggered. His assistant, Carla, had already alerted the company's top brass, and within minutes, a full internal review was set into motion. The CEO didn't need to say much. His presence alone spoke volumes. He wasn't angry, just resolute. His focus was on what needed to be done next. His calmness in the face of such blatant disrespect was the true power he held. As the executives briefed him on the next steps, the CEO's mind wandered back to the incident. It wasn't just about the flight. It wasn't even about Linda or the flight attendants. It was about something far more significant. It was about the biases that existed within the company he had spent years building from the ground up. It was about the way people like him had been treated all their lives. He had fought his way to the top, overcoming every barrier set before him. And yet, here he was, still having to prove his worth in ways that no one else ever had to. The flight attendant's actions were a painful reminder of the work still left to be done. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened on that flight spread quickly. It wasn't just a viral video anymore. It was the beginning of a conversation that needed to happen. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with reactions from all over the world. People were divided. Some applauded the CEO for standing up against the bias, while others criticized him for the way he handled the situation. But no one could deny the truth that was revealed. The incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that stretched beyond the walls of the airline and into the corporate world as a whole. For years, biases, both overt and covert, had been allowed to run rampant, unchecked, with no one in power willing to stand up and say enough was enough. The CEO's company, once seen as a model of success, now found itself at the center of a storm of controversy. But rather than shy away from it, the CEO decided to take charge. He held an emergency meeting with his leadership team and announced that a comprehensive review of the company's policies and practices would be conducted. Every department, every branch, and every individual would be scrutinized to ensure that nothing like what had happened on that flight would ever occur again. The internal audit would be thorough, no stone left unturned. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, but it was necessary. Change had to start from within, and it had to start now. Back in the airport terminal, Linda sat in the break room. Her head hung low as she replayed the events in her mind. She had tried to brush off the moment when the CEO had first stepped onto the plane, convinced that he didn't belong in first class. It was just another day, another flight, and she had done what she thought was right. But now, as the reality of the situation hit her, she realized how wrong she had been. She had let her assumptions take over, and in doing so, she had hurt someone who had the power to bring the entire airline to its knees. She had acted out of ignorance, and now, she had to face the consequences. She wondered if she would even have a job by the end of the day. The following morning, the CEO held another meeting, this time with the airline's board of directors. He made it clear that this incident was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to fire a few employees or sweep the issue under the rug. This was an opportunity to reshape the company, to create a culture where diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords, but core values. The company had to take a hard look at itself, not just in terms of what it had done wrong, but in terms of what it could do better. The CEO wasn't just looking to make amends. He was looking to lead a transformation. And he knew that this wasn't going to be an easy road. But he was ready to take it. Meanwhile, the media continued to follow the story, and the public's reaction was growing louder. People were talking about the CEO's actions, but they were also talking about the bigger issue: systemic racism in corporate America. This wasn't just one incident. This was a recurring theme, something that millions of people had experienced and been forced to endure for generations. The conversation was shifting. More and more, people were speaking out, demanding change. It was clear that the world was ready for a reckoning. As the CEO prepared for the next phase of the company's transformation, he couldn't help but think about the impact of that single moment on the plane. What had started as a routine flight had now become the catalyst for a movement. And it was just the beginning. The CEO knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to see it through. He had built his success on hard work, perseverance, and the belief that anything was possible. And now, with his leadership, he was going to build a company that reflected those same values. No more discrimination, no more bias. The message was clear: if you weren't part of the solution, you were part of the problem. Yindi, as the days passed, the media frenzy surrounding the incident on the flight only grew. News outlets covered the story from every angle, analyzing the CEO's actions, while social media exploded with opinions and reactions. People from all over the world were discussing what had happened, and it was clear that the conversation was shifting. The CEO's decision to stand up against the blatant discrimination on that flight had sparked something much larger, a conversation about race, power, and the systemic biases that still existed in every corner of society. The story wasn't just about one flight, one moment of confrontation. It had become a symbol of the fight against inequality. In the meantime, the CEO had put his plan into motion. The internal review of the company was now underway, and he was personally overseeing every step. Carla, his assistant, worked around the clock to ensure that every department was thoroughly examined. She pulled reports, scheduled meetings, and made sure that no stone was left unturned. The CEO had made it clear to the board. This wasn't just a public relations stunt. This was a fundamental shift in how the company operated. The airline had been built on the backs of hard-working people, and now it was time for that same workforce to understand that no one, no matter their position, was above the responsibility to treat others with respect. Linda, the flight attendant at the center of the storm, was placed on indefinite leave pending the results of the investigation. She sat in her small apartment, staring out the window as the weight of her actions settled in. The fallout had been swift and harsh. She had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and she knew it. She thought about the look on the CEO's face when he revealed his true identity, how calm and composed he had been in the face of her insults, how she had failed to recognize him, failed to see the man behind the clothes, and how that single moment had cost her everything. She had been given a position of power and authority, but in her moment of judgment, she had abused it. Now, she had to face the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, the CEO was not interested in looking back. He knew the media had moved on to other stories, but he also knew that the conversation about inequality wasn't going anywhere. His actions had started something that was bigger than him, bigger than the airline. It had sparked a much-needed discussion about the deep-seated biases that affected every industry, from aviation to tech to politics. The CEO knew that this was just the beginning. He was determined to continue leading the charge for change. He had already reached out to other business leaders, encouraging them to join the effort to create more equitable workplaces. He was building a coalition of like-minded executives who understood that this wasn't just a moral issue, but one that had a profound impact on business and society. In the following weeks, the airline's leadership team began implementing the changes the CEO had outlined. Diversity and inclusion were now at the forefront of every initiative. The company's human resources department launched new training programs for all employees, focusing on unconscious bias, cultural competence, and the importance of diversity. In the workplace, the CEO personally addressed the employees during a company-wide meeting, emphasizing the need for change and explaining the importance of holding one another accountable. "This is not just about making ourselves look good," he said. "This is about creating a workplace where every person, no matter their background, can succeed and thrive. It's about being better than the biases that have been allowed to define us for far too long. And it's about time we start doing the hard work of dismantling those biases, one step at a time." His words resonated with many employees, and some even began to speak out about their own experiences with discrimination. The CEO had created an environment where it was safe to talk about uncomfortable truths, and that was a powerful first step toward real change. As the changes took root within the company, the CEO's reputation continued to grow. What had started as a viral incident on a plane had transformed into a movement, one that challenged the status quo and demanded accountability. People from all over the country began reaching out to the CEO, thanking him for taking a stand and for using his position of power to make a difference. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others simply expressed their admiration for his leadership. The CEO had become a symbol of hope for many, and he knew that he had a responsibility to keep pushing for change, even when it wasn't easy. But not everyone was on board with the CEO's message. As the company moved forward with its initiatives, there were those who resisted, those who were uncomfortable with the idea of change. Some of the employees who had been at the forefront of the discrimination incident tried to downplay their actions, claiming they were just following protocol or acting out of habit. But the CEO wasn't having it. "This is not about just following the rules," he told the leadership team. "This is about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. If you can't understand that, then you have no place in this company." It was a harsh message, but one that needed to be heard. The CEO knew that true change required making tough decisions, and he was prepared to do whatever it took. The results of the internal investigation were released, and the findings were damning. The airline's leadership team, from top to bottom, had failed to address the systemic biases that had been ingrained in the company's culture. The CEO was not surprised by the findings, but he was determined to take action. He fired several senior managers, including those who had been directly involved in the incident with Linda. It was a tough decision, But the CEO knew that it was necessary to send a clear message. No one was above the law, and no one would be allowed to perpetuate the system of bias any longer. As the weeks turned into months, the CEO watched as the company began to transform. The changes were not just visible in the numbers. More diverse candidates were being hired, and employee retention rates were improving. But they were also evident in the attitudes of the staff. There was a newfound sense of unity within the company, as employees from all backgrounds came together to work toward a common goal. The culture of fear and discrimination that had once plagued the airline was slowly but surely being replaced by one of inclusivity and respect. But the CEO knew that this was only the beginning. The battle against systemic racism and bias was far from over. He had made great strides, but he was determined to keep fighting, not just for his company, but for everyone who had ever been held back by the invisible walls of discrimination. He knew that the work would never be finished, but he was ready to continue the fight. And with that resolve, he looked out the window of his office, knowing that the future was bright, because the change he had started was unstoppable. The months that followed saw the company undergo a remarkable transformation. What had started as a viral incident on a plane had now become the catalyst for an industry-wide conversation about systemic bias and inequality. The CEO, once just a figurehead in the corporate world, had emerged as a leader who wasn't afraid to take risks, make hard decisions, and challenge the status quo. His leadership had already begun to reshape the culture of his company, but he knew the journey was far from over. While progress had been made, there was still much to be done. The internal audits had uncovered deep-rooted issues within the company's structure, and the CEO was determined to fix them one step at a time. In the boardrooms and offices of the airline, change was becoming more than just a concept. It was becoming a reality. The CEO worked tirelessly with his team to implement new diversity initiatives, pushing for inclusive hiring practices and better training programs that addressed not just racial biases, but all forms of discrimination. He demanded that every employee, from the ground staff to senior leadership, undergo comprehensive diversity and inclusion training. No longer would the company tolerate the kind of discriminatory behavior that had sparked the viral incident on the plane. As the training programs rolled out, the CEO also established a new system of accountability, one where every action, no matter how small, would be scrutinized and held to the highest standards. For Linda, the flight attendant who had sparked the controversy, the months after the incident were a time of deep reflection. She had been fired from the airline, as was customary when someone violated the company's newly implemented policies. She tried to find work at other airlines, but the stain of her actions followed her everywhere. No matter where she went, she couldn't shake the feeling of failure that clung to her. She had been part of the problem, and now she was being forced to reckon with it. But what troubled her more than her professional downfall was the personal reckoning. Linda realized that, in that moment on the plane, she had failed to recognize the man in front of her. She had judged him not by his qualifications or identity, but by the assumptions she had been taught to make. She had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had become complicit in perpetuating the very system that had held her and others back. Across the country, the CEO's efforts to address the biases within his company had sparked a ripple effect. Other business leaders began reaching out, asking him for advice on how to implement similar changes within their own companies. The CEO had become a trailblazer, not just for his airline, but for the entire corporate world. His message was simple. True leadership meant creating a culture where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, had the opportunity to succeed. He knew that there was still resistance in certain corners of the corporate world, but he was undeterred. He had fought his way to the top, and now he was using that position to fight for something greater. The CEO's company was now being recognized for its efforts. Awards for diversity and inclusion began pouring in, and the airline's reputation as a progressive, inclusive organization spread far and wide. But the CEO wasn't content with just the accolades. He knew that this change had to go deeper than just public recognition. He focused on long-term strategies that would ensure the company's culture of inclusion was sustained. He worked closely with HR to create pathways for advancement for underrepresented groups within the company, ensuring that they had not just access to jobs, but also the opportunity for growth. Mentorship programs were introduced to provide guidance and support to employees from all backgrounds, giving them the tools they needed to succeed in leadership roles. Meanwhile, Linda had taken a step back from her career, using the time to reflect on what had happened and how she could be part of the solution moving forward. She had started attending counseling and diversity workshops, determined to understand the roots of her own biases and how to unlearn them. It wasn't an easy process, and at times, she felt ashamed of her past actions. But she was committed to the work, understanding that true change required not just a change in behavior, but a change in mindset. She realized that she had spent so much time focused on fitting into a system that was built to exclude people like the CEO that she had never questioned its fairness. Now, she was determined to be part of the movement that would dismantle those systems from the inside. As the CEO looked at the progress his company had made, he knew that they had only scratched the surface. The work was far from over. The culture of discrimination and bias was pervasive in many industries, not just aviation, and he was determined to use his platform to continue to advocate for change. He knew that he had a responsibility to the people who had supported him, to the employees who had trusted him to make things right, and to the future generations who would inherit the world they were shaping today. He wasn't just changing his company, he was changing the future of business. The CEO had also begun to speak at conferences and forums, using his platform to advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He spoke about the importance of creating workplaces that reflected the world they lived in, where everyone was given the opportunity to succeed. His message resonated with many, and his influence continued to grow. But he also knew that the work required more than just speeches and policies. It required action. And so, he kept pushing forward, never losing sight of the goal, to create a world where bias no longer dictated who succeeded and who was left behind. As time went on, Linda's journey of self-reflection continued. She wasn't sure where her future would take her, but she was determined to ensure that her next steps would be aligned with the values of equality and fairness. She understood that her past actions couldn't be undone, but she could control what she did moving forward. And in that, she found a sense of peace. The CEO's actions had changed the trajectory of his company, but they had also changed the lives of those who had witnessed the event, and the lives of those who had been a part of the larger movement for change. The CEO's company continued to thrive, its reputation for diversity and inclusion becoming a model for others to follow. But the CEO was always looking forward, always thinking about the next steps. He knew that the fight for equality wasn't over, and that every day was an opportunity to make a difference. And with that resolve, he continued to lead, not just his company, but the movement for a better, more inclusive world. Yendi, as the CEO, continued to push forward with his mission to transform the company. He faced increasing pressure from both external critics and internal resistance. The changes he was implementing were bold, and while many employees were supportive, others found the process uncomfortable. Some feared that the new diversity initiatives were too much too fast, and they questioned whether the company's long-standing traditions were being abandoned too quickly. But the CEO was resolute. He knew that real change required disruption, and he wasn't willing to back down just because it made people uncomfortable. He had already made significant strides in reshaping the culture of his company, but he was determined to go even further. Meanwhile, Linda's journey of personal growth continued, though she was still facing the consequences of her actions. She had attended several workshops and seminars focused on diversity and inclusion, hoping to understand where her biases had come from and how to dismantle them. At times, the process was painful. It was difficult to confront her own shortcomings, and even more difficult to realize how her actions had contributed to a system of discrimination. But Linda understood that this was the work she had to do. She had spent years excusing her behavior, telling herself that she was just following orders or doing what was expected. Now, she understood that the system itself was flawed, and that her complicity in it had real-world consequences. The more Linda reflected on the events that had unfolded, the more she realized that it wasn't just about her mistake on the plane. It was about the larger system that had allowed her actions to go unchecked for so long. The assumptions she had made, the biases she had held, had been ingrained in her by years of cultural conditioning. But that conditioning could be undone. Linda was committed to the idea of reprogramming her thinking, of unlearning the biases that had shaped her worldview for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to try. Across the company, the CEO's leadership was starting to show results. Employee engagement was at an all-time high, and the number of diverse candidates applying for positions had significantly increased. The CEO's commitment to diversity was no longer just a policy. It had become a core part of the company's identity. He knew that creating a truly inclusive workplace required more than just hiring diverse talent. It required creating an environment where everyone felt like they belonged, where their voices were heard, and where they were given the support they needed to thrive. As the company continued to grow and evolve, the CEO began to turn his attention outward. He started meeting with other leaders in the business community, sharing his vision for a more inclusive corporate world and encouraging them to take similar steps within their own companies. The response was mixed. Some were eager to jump on board, while others were skeptical, unsure of how to implement such significant changes in their own organizations. The CEO didn't back down, though. He knew that this movement couldn't stop at his company. It had to spread, and he was determined to be at the forefront of that change. Meanwhile, the public continued to watch the CEO's every move. His story had become a beacon of hope for those who had been fighting for equality in the workplace for years. People were inspired by his willingness to stand up to bias, even when it meant risking everything. His example had inspired many others to speak out about their own experiences with discrimination, and the #MeToo movement had gained new momentum as more voices joined the conversation. But despite the growing support for his efforts, the CEO knew that there were still many hurdles to overcome. Not everyone was on board with the changes he was making, and he had already faced pushback from some of his senior executives. These were the same people who had been complicit in the company's past practices, and now they were resistant to the changes he was pushing for. They had built their careers on a system of exclusion, and they didn't want to let go of their old ways of thinking. But the CEO wasn't intimidated. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to keep fighting. He had already sacrificed too much to let this moment pass without making a lasting impact. As he sat in his office one evening, reflecting on the journey so far, the CEO thought about the future. He thought about the young people who would come to work for his company in the years ahead. What kind of world would they inherit? What kind of workplace would they walk into? He wanted it to be a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. He wanted to leave a legacy of fairness and equality that would echo for generations. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Change takes time, and it requires constant effort. He wasn't naive enough to believe that everything could be fixed in a few months, but he was determined to keep pushing, no matter the obstacles. The story of the flight attendant and the CEO had become a turning point, not just for their company, but for the entire industry. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions can have a ripple effect, and that standing up for what's right can inspire others to do the same. Linda, though she had lost her job, was beginning to understand the power of accountability. She had made a mistake, but that mistake had sparked a movement, and she was now committed to being a part of the solution. The CEO's efforts were far from over. As he continued to lead his company through this difficult process, he knew that he was making a difference, not just for the people who worked for him, but for the millions of people who had been affected by the same kind of discrimination. He had learned that true leadership was about more than just managing a business. It was about creating a culture of inclusion and respect. It was about using his platform to make the world a better place, one decision at a time. Yet as the months rolled by, the momentum for change within the company continued to grow. The CEO had made significant strides in reshaping the culture, but he knew that the true test of his leadership would come in the long term. The employees were starting to buy into the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but many were still adjusting to the new reality. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, and the CEO was keenly aware that true transformation took time. There were still moments when he encountered resistance, but he had learned to face those moments head-on, understanding that change was often met with discomfort. He was prepared to weather the storm and push through, because he knew the impact of this transformation would go far beyond the walls of his company. Linda, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, had spent the last few months in a quiet state of reflection. Her departure from the airline had been a wake-up call, and the months since had given her the space to examine her role in perpetuating the systemic biases that had once defined her life. She had begun attending workshops and counseling sessions, aiming to dismantle the biases she had spent years unknowingly nurturing. It wasn't easy work, and at times, she felt overwhelmed by the weight of her past actions. But Linda was committed to the process. She knew that it was her responsibility to unlearn what she had been taught and to actively work toward becoming part of the solution. It wasn't just about getting a job in the future. It was about changing the way she saw the world and, ultimately, the way she treated others. The CEO had continued to lead the company through its transformation, making difficult decisions and staying true to his mission. One of his most important initiatives was the launch of a mentorship program designed to help underrepresented employees rise through the ranks. The program paired junior employees with senior leaders, ensuring that people of all backgrounds had the support they needed to thrive. The mentorship program quickly became a success, with many employees reporting a greater sense of belonging and opportunity within the company. The CEO had always believed that the true measure of a leader was not how they led in the best of times, but how they acted in the face of adversity. And now, he was seeing the results of his commitment to fostering diversity at every level of the company. Despite the progress, the CEO knew that the work was far from over. While the company had made great strides in embracing inclusivity, he still faced an industry that was, in many ways, stuck in its ways. There were other companies that were still lagging behind, slow to adopt the changes that were taking place within his own. The CEO began using his platform to speak out about these issues, reaching out to leaders in other sectors to encourage them to join the fight for equality. His voice, once confined to the boardroom, was now being heard on a much larger scale. He was being invited to speak at conferences, to participate in discussions about race and equity in the workplace, and to help shape policies that could have a broader impact on the business world as a whole. But not everyone was ready to listen. Some people in the industry, particularly those who had benefited from the old system, were skeptical of the changes. They saw the CEO's efforts as a threat to the status quo, a disruption of the way things had always been. There were those who resisted, who pushed back against the notion that change was necessary, and who believed that the existing power structures were in place for a reason. For the CEO, these voices were not unexpected. He had dealt with pushback throughout his career. But the stakes were higher now. The world was watching, and the conversation had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. As Linda continued her journey of self-discovery, she began to feel a sense of responsibility to speak out about her past actions. She had been one of the people who had upheld the system of discrimination, and she knew that she had a unique perspective to offer. Linda decided to write a letter to the CEO, expressing her regret for the role she had played in the incident and outlining the steps she had taken to address her biases. She had no expectation that the CEO would read the letter, but for her, it was an important step in taking responsibility for her actions. To her surprise, she received a response just a few days later. The CEO thanked her for her honesty and for the work she was doing to change. He encouraged her to continue on her path and to use her experiences to help others. The CEO's response was not only kind, but it was a reminder that true leadership was about forgiveness and growth, not just punishment. As Linda reflected on the CEO's response, she realized that this was the first time in her life that she had truly felt seen. She had spent so long trying to fit into a system that was designed to exclude people like her, and now, she had a chance to make a real difference. She had a responsibility to herself and to others to be part of the solution, and that meant speaking out against the biases she had once ignored. It wasn't going to be easy, but Linda was ready to take on the challenge. The CEO, for his part, continued to push forward with his vision. The mentorship program had already begun to bear fruit, and the company's new diversity initiatives were being heralded as a model for other organizations to follow. But despite the successes, the CEO knew that the work had only just begun. The road to true equality would be long and filled with obstacles, but he was prepared to face them head-on. He had built his career on perseverance and determination, and he knew that the same traits would be required to change the culture of an entire industry. Months later, the company had reached a turning point. The airline's reputation had improved dramatically, and it was now seen as one of the most forward-thinking companies in its sector. Employees were happier, more engaged, and more likely to stay with the company long-term. The CEO's leadership had made all the difference. But he also knew that This wasn't just about the company's success. It was about the future of business and the role he could play in shaping it. He had learned that true leadership wasn't just about making money. It was about making a difference. And that's exactly what he planned to do. As the months continued to pass, the changes that the CEO had put into motion began to take root across the company. The ripple effect of his actions spread far beyond the walls of the airline, reaching other industries and prompting conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in places where those topics had previously been ignored or dismissed. The CEO, once known primarily for his sharp business acumen, was now being recognized as a trailblazer in corporate leadership, a man who had used his position of power not for personal gain, but to challenge a broken system. He had never imagined that one act of standing up to racial bias on a plane would lead to this, but as the months went by, it was clear that the movement he had started was much bigger than anyone had anticipated. The internal changes within the company were equally significant. The mentorship programs were growing, with more and more senior leaders stepping up to guide and support younger, underrepresented employees. The company had launched leadership development initiatives aimed specifically at giving people of color the tools and resources they needed to rise through the ranks. The number of people of diverse backgrounds applying for leadership roles had skyrocketed, and for the first time, employees felt like their contributions were valued beyond just their work. They felt seen, heard, and respected. This transformation, the CEO knew, was only the beginning. He had set out to create a company where equality wasn't just a goal, it was a reality. Linda, still working on herself, had been following the changes within the company closely. After months of reflection and self-education, she began to see the world differently. She had started taking part in speaking engagements at diversity workshops, sharing her story with others, and highlighting the importance of personal growth in the fight against systemic bias. While her past actions would always be a part of her story, Linda was determined to use her experience to help others recognize the harmful effects of their own assumptions. She had become an advocate for change, not just in the corporate world, but in her personal life as well. Linda knew that she had a long way to go, but she was proud of the steps she had taken. She had gone from a place of ignorance and bias to one of understanding and responsibility. One afternoon, Linda received an unexpected call from the CEO. It had been months since the incident on the plane, and she had assumed he had moved on. But the CEO wanted to speak with her. "I've been following your journey," he said, "and I want you to know that I see the work you're doing. I think it's important, and I'd like to help you get your voice out there even more." Linda was stunned. She hadn't expected this kind of recognition from the man she had wronged. He went on to say that he wanted to partner with her on a new initiative within the company, aimed at providing resources and support for employees who wanted to embark on their own personal journeys of self-awareness and growth. Linda felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and a deep sense of purpose. She had spent so many months struggling to find redemption, and now, here was the opportunity to turn her experience into something positive. She agreed to the project without hesitation. Meanwhile, the CEO had begun to reflect on the broader implications of the company's changes. He had always known that change in any large organization wouldn't happen overnight, but the progress he was seeing was encouraging. The company's culture had become more inclusive, its policies more transparent, and its leadership team more representative of the world around them. However, the CEO was not satisfied. He knew that the work was far from complete. He wanted to see more companies follow the same path, but he also recognized that it wasn't just about implementing policies. It was about a fundamental shift in mindset. Businesses had to start recognizing that diversity was not just a buzzword, but a business imperative. Companies that failed to adapt to the changing demographics and demands of the workforce were going to get left behind. In his speeches and public appearances, the CEO began to drive this point home. He spoke not just about the success of his company, but about the success of companies that embrace diversity. He shared data showing that diverse teams performed better, that inclusive cultures attracted top talent, and that companies committed to equity had lower turnover and higher employee satisfaction. His message was clear. Businesses that ignored diversity were not just failing to live up to the moment, they were actively harming their bottom lines. The CEO knew that his company's transformation was just a small part of a much larger, global shift, but he was determined to make his company a beacon for what the future of business could look like. The CEO's actions continued to have far-reaching effects. Soon, other industries began to take notice. Technology companies, in particular, began looking to the airline as a model for how to incorporate diversity and inclusion into their core practices. The CEO was invited to sit on panels, to meet with top leaders in the tech world, and to speak at conferences where his message of inclusion was being embraced with enthusiasm. It wasn't just about making a point. It was about making a real, lasting change in the way businesses operated. The CEO was becoming a force for transformation, and he knew that his work had only just begun. As for Linda, her partnership with the CEO brought new opportunities. She began leading workshops within the company, helping others see the importance of confronting their own biases and starting their own paths toward growth. She had become a symbol of change, not because of her past mistakes, but because of the work she was now doing to undo the harm that she had caused. She knew she would never fully escape her past, but that didn't matter to her anymore. What mattered was the future, and she was determined to make it a better place for everyone. The company, under the CEO's leadership, continued to grow and evolve, with diversity and inclusion at the heart of everything it did. The journey was far from over, but with every step forward, the company was proving that change was possible, and that the future of business could be one where everyone, regardless of their background, had the opportunity to succeed. As the year came to a close, the CEO reflected on how far his company had come since that fateful flight incident. What had started as a viral moment of injustice had sparked a fundamental shift, not just within his own organization, but across the industry as a whole. The changes were visible, tangible, and undeniable. Employees now felt a sense of belonging, no longer just token representatives of a company's diversity, but valued voices in the conversation. The mentorship programs had proven successful, and the airline's leadership was increasingly reflective of the world around them. Yet, despite all the progress, the CEO knew that this transformation was only the beginning. The work ahead was even more critical. The company's culture had changed, but the world had not yet fully embraced the change that was necessary in business and society. The CEO's efforts were beginning to set a precedent, and other businesses were starting to take notice. His company had become a benchmark for inclusive corporate practices, and the CEO was being sought after by business leaders and organizations around the world. He had delivered keynotes at conferences, been featured in leadership magazines, and consulted with other companies looking to adopt similar strategies. Despite the accolades, he remained focused on his original goal, to create a truly inclusive environment where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, had the same opportunities for success. The CEO knew that this wasn't just about diversifying his workforce. It was about building a legacy of equity that would leave an indelible mark on the business world. Linda, too, had been busy. She was no longer just the flight attendant who had made a mistake. She had become an advocate for diversity and inclusion within the company. Her efforts had led to the development of new training initiatives, and she now worked closely with HR and senior leadership to create systems that would prevent discrimination in the future. Linda had spoken publicly about her journey, acknowledging her past actions but emphasizing the power of redemption and the importance of personal growth. She had become a symbol of the kind of change the CEO had been pushing for, someone who had learned from their mistakes and was actively working to make the world a better place. Her transformation had not only changed her life, but had also inspired others within the company to start their own journeys of self-awareness. However, as Linda's influence within the company grew, she also realized that the fight for justice was never over. There would always be work to be done. While the company had made tremendous strides in cultivating an inclusive culture, there were still moments of subtle bias, overlooked opportunities, and unconscious prejudice that needed to be addressed. Linda worked tirelessly to ensure that these moments were caught and corrected, helping her colleagues and fellow employees confront their biases before they could become a systemic problem. Her role had evolved beyond that of a mentor or advocate. She had become a leader in her own right, teaching others not just about the importance of diversity, but about the difficult, uncomfortable work that came with creating real change. For the CEO, the experience had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, responsibility, and the importance of leading by example. He had always prided himself on making tough decisions, but this was different. This wasn't just about business. It was about ethics, human dignity, and doing what was right, no matter the cost. As he looked out over the company he had built, he knew that the work was not yet done. He was committed to making sure that future generations of leaders would inherit a world that valued inclusivity, where racial and gender biases no longer held people back. The impact of the changes he had initiated would ripple through the industry for years to come. The company's success had not only transformed its own culture, but it sparked a global conversation about the need for systemic change in all industries. More and more companies were beginning to adopt the same inclusive practices, and the CEO had become a key figure in pushing for that shift. But while the CEO was proud of the progress his company had made, he knew that true equality would not be achieved until the business world as a whole recognized the importance of fostering diversity and inclusion at every level. He had become more than just a business leader. He had become an advocate for a movement that was bigger than himself, a movement that aimed to create a more equitable world for everyone. As the year ended, the CEO took a moment to reflect on the future. He had built something meaningful, something that transcended profit margins and quarterly earnings. His company was no longer just a business. It was a force for change, a symbol of the power that can be wielded when people are given the opportunity to thrive, no matter who they are or where they come from. The CEO looked out of his office window at the city below, the lights of the skyline twinkling in the distance. He knew that the future was uncertain, but he was more determined than ever to keep pushing forward. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be obstacles to overcome, but the CEO was ready. He had seen firsthand the power of standing up for what was right, and now he was more committed than ever to making sure that the work they had started continued, long after he had passed the torch to the next generation of leaders. Indy.